Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about Extreme Ghostbusters Season 1, because there was only one, episodes 1 through 15. So, ultimately, I'm going to try as much as possible to do these 15 episodes in a very quick like motion. So ultimately, I'm gonna give you kind of the ghost names and kind of why kind of like what I felt was important about each one of these episodes. But I'm also going to give you like if you don't know what this show is, or if you like are kind of intrigued on some of like if you only know the Ghostbusters movies, if you only know this and that, I'm gonna kind of give you a lead up to ultimately help you understand where I come from Ghostbusters in general, and then ultimately knowing full well to where eventually I'm going to give you a familiarity of how I felt about Extreme Ghostbusters, and then ultimately we'll break down each episode and how I felt about them. So, going into Ghostbusters, recently I've seen probably the first and second movie probably more than 100 plus times. I say that now because ultimately I don't even know how many times I've seen those movies, because ultimately it would show up every holiday. I would end up watching them, so I've probably seen it probably more than probably 200 plus times each movie. Then ultimately I kind of would bleed into like the real Ghostbusters. I think my favorite episode of the real Ghostbusters, which is probably the most bizarrish like episode to like the most. My favorite episode is Night Game, which is probably the weirdest episode to enjoy out of all the Ghostbusters movies because it's just an episode about a baseball game. But when looking at it, I really liked that. I think my favorite part is that that episode kind of focused on Winston a lot and reasonably it's a simple episode about baseball. Like basically you have Winston who is really to have to save one soul, and ultimately we find out and realize within this episode that no one is neutral, uh, and that ultimately if good cheats, evil automatically wins. And like a lot of that episode I really enjoyed, and it was really fun for me. So if you guys don't know that the real Ghostbusters exist, now we're going to go into Extreme Ghostbusters, which is actually the sequel quasi to the real Ghostbusters. So if you've never seen probably an episode of the real Ghostbusters, more than likely I would probably best say that if you've probably seen the Ghostbusters movies, and then you're going into the real Ghostbusters to understand Extreme Ghostbusters, I would probably say the best episode to probably understand the bridge of gap between the Ghostbusters going into real Ghostbusters, the best episode is probably Citizen Ghosts, where ultimately you have it to where the Ghostbusters are all wearing the Ghostbusters uniforms from the Ghostbusters movies to transition to different Ghostbusters uniforms, and then really there's a whole backstory about I think why Slimer became such an important character in the Ghostbusters episodes. So yeah, really very much an interesting aspect of just figuring out what is the best episode for everyone to enjoy. So now going into Extreme Ghostbusters, kind of breaking down the characters a little bit more because people may have never heard of this series in their life. I remember watching Extreme Ghostbusters because ultimately this was right around that same sweet spot of me going into shul or school. And so right before I would go to school every day on the weekdays, I would end up being able to usually watch Extreme Ghostbusters and probably the cartoon variation or animated variation of the show Jumanji, which is weird. Uh, like I just kind of saw both of these episodes just because it was on the same network and or channel, and so ultimately I was just like I kind of put up with Jumanji, but I was waiting for Extreme Ghostbusters. So yeah, I got to watch those, which was great. Because ultimately I was like, hey, this is an actual series that I just stumbled upon, and then later on I ended up getting like the bootlegged ish like copy of Extreme Ghostbusters, and then being able to actually physically watch the entire series because I don't think I watched the entire thing. I was just like, man, these episodes are great. I love these episodes. And so then eventually realizing now this entire show, supposedly for I don't know how long, is on Hulu. So ultimately, if you're wanting to check this series out and you without a doubt can't find a real reasonable way of watching it, I would say find a freaking bootleg app like a movie pro or something like that. But ultimately, realize right now it's on Hulu for I don't know however long. So going into this, let's talk about and break down some of the characters and who they are. If anything, by and large, I don't think I need to break down like really who Egon is and who Janine is and who Slimer is. I think people will know who they are. And I don't think they drastically change from the real Ghostbusters to now this. If ultimately you've never seen the real Ghostbusters, this show is basically a sequel from off of that. Basically, the equipment that they use is basically like early on in the show is basically like tapering off of the real Ghostbusters. So yeah, so when going into this, it's basically a sequel from the real Ghostbusters. And then also they tangent back onto, towards the end of this series, bringing back actually the real Ghostbusters guys. You get Peter, you get Ray, you get Winston coming back towards the end of this show. So ultimately, the best reason to want to watch this show even more, especially if not to maybe get the first beginning of it and then go to the tail end to see those great episodes of knowing full well that those things happen within this. All more reason to really appreciate this show for what it is. So, going into this, let's break down the new characters that are really very much in the forefront of being showcased onto this show. I know that the comic books, the Ghostbusters comic books, eventually at some point cover Extreme Ghostbusters, and I guess all more reason to really help us really get to understand these characters via another medium. But anyways, let's go in and break down each one of these characters. Let's talk about how I enjoyed them, and also the show in general. Because the show for me, honestly, was very much more darker and grittier. Kind of looking at all these movies, or like looking at all these episodes and seeing them being blatantly ripped off from a lot of movies, or seemingly there was some episodes that felt blatantly ripped off from other Ghostbusters like episodes. So ultimately, knowing full well we have seemingly some episodes where they kind of blatantly tell you where they got the reference from, or ultimately, yeah, just some interesting characters that they plop in, or some interesting ghosts that they plop in from time to time. I'm going to try to give you every single name of every single ghost that, or main monster that appears in every episode. And so, yeah, I'm going to kind of reflect on how I felt about each episode. More than likely, considering the beginning of this series has a 3 episode arc story to kind of transition to a lot of things. Yeah, it's going to be the same monster for 3 episodes. So, yeah, So let's break down the characters. So reasonably, the one that I want to kind of focus on very first is Eduardo. So reasonably, Eduardo basically is kind of the Peter Venkman-esque like character that really he's like, I say Peter Venkman in just the fact that he's much more of a guy that chases skirts more than anybody else does in this show. Because probably Garrett probably could, but no. Eduardo is the very much person that very much chases skirts more than anybody, but reasonably, Eduardo doesn't have the confidence that Peter has. If anything, Garrett probably has that. We have to where Eduardo is basically the cowardly person that usually runs away. The guy that's usually kind of scared of everything. And like he's kind of like I would probably have him if we're going with a Scooby Doo trying to figure out who Eduardo is through the Scooby Doo realm of things. Like I think he's very much a character that needs to be like saved all the time. So he's kind of uh like the Velma, I think the character that ultimately usually has to get saved by everybody, or usually he's just a person that I don't even know if I got that Scooby Doo character correct. But anyways, yeah, he's very much a cowardly ash like person. But when looking at it, there's sometimes where even he can figure out how to solve cases of a lot of these or quite a few of these episodes. Or sometimes he is the person that is seemingly pushing to be the affected party of a lot of these episodes, where again you kind of either have to save Eduardo or ultimately just hopefully figure out how to beat the ghost and then save Eduardo in the process. So going into this, yeah, Eduardo has kind of like he's dumb, but then a lot of times it seems like there is some bizarre thing out of left field that helps Eduardo, knowing full well through this show to help us through episodes. So Eduardo is kind of like the left field guy that ultimately justifiably tapers in some knowledge of something that, like, I think he is kind of like the layman's terms guy, which ultimately he's the person that needs to be explained everything in layman's terms for people to understand. And then he is like, hey, why is it that I have to be the person that has to be like explained everything to me like I'm a child? And it's like, well, because reasonably, like, there's probably a child that's watching the show, and so you have to be the dumb person that has to be broken down to make things sound much more simpler than they really are. So, pushing on, we have Kylie, that is kind of the in the ghost realm of things. She is the Egon of that. She is just kind of like a very much bookworm, book smarts like person, but a lot of times she has the confidence of Peter, to the point to where ultimately she is very much like wanting to be such a strong character, but a lot of the times she also needs to be saved. So like she's like this kind of very like middle of the ground character where it's like she wants to seem so confident and so strong, but then again, like a lot of times too, she like can't handle a lot of things, which is kind of interesting to see her break down and to see her scream or cry or whatever. But not to say that she's the weakest character. If anything, she's pretty much stronger than most of any of the other characters. We have it to where, like, I think Kylie is to the point of really just being a very much more well-rounded character than I think a lot of the other characters. Kylie at a lot of points is kind of written in some episodes where she like wants to be one of the guys, and there's sometimes where she wants to be treated just like anybody else even though she is a female. And like that kind of really comes off as just like, man, this, like, I really like this character because yeah, there's points where it does feel like she, like, there's just kind of these mixture of episodes where sometimes she's a really strong character and she can make mistakes, but ultimately she quickly like earns the respect of people at the end of the day to kind of turn things around. I don't think that Kylie really is the person to have a lot of the answers for the big ghosts at the end of all this. Like, I don't think she's usually the brain person that comes up with a lot of the times figuring out, like, hey, how to beat everything. I think Eduardo kind of randomly comes up with kind of stuff most of the time, or probably Roland, I think, is much more of the answer guy to figure out how to beat things, or Egon is, or stuff like that. But I think reasonably, like, I think Kylie is a person that could easily bounce a lot of stuff off of people. Like, she could probably troubleshoot her way through things if she has others to just kind of uh, figure things out with. So, like, for her, she can probably figure out things, but it's kind of like a collaborative effort. So, give her points for that. So, now we have Garrett and Roland. So, Garrett, very much handicapped like person. We have to mention that because I think that's the best thing about this show is to really have a diverse character that we don't see every day through every cartoons. And that's the thing I love about this show the most is you kind of take this left wing like character and I'm like, oh wow, we have a person in a wheelchair that basically this character does not let his handicapped like basically change anything. If anything, the best thing about this character is that he is handicapped. Like, weirdly enough, like he like takes everything in such stride, and like basically he has more confidence than anybody in this show. And recently he's very street smart, and recently he is the person that is going into a lot of things guns blazing, cowboying up, and then realizing that he came into something without a lick of any plan, and then ultimately he has to run back out to say, hey, what is the plan that we're going to have for this? Because I just came in here and, yeah, didn't quite work out. So now I have egg on my face, and so what are we going to do? That's the thing that I like about Garrett is that he goes in guns blazing, but reasonably. For Ghostbusters, it's like you always have to come in with everything with a plan, because reasonably you can't just blast everything and hope for the best. And like it is kind of funny to where kind of like Eduardo and Garrett kind of have this consistent like back and forth, like they have to give one another crap, and also they have to kind of really very much be the people that are going to give crap to every single person that they work with. And I find that really interesting. I think Kylie does that as well, but like I think if anything, she probably gives more crap to Eduardo because it seems bizarrely like he's chasing her skirt, and so ultimately it's like the two that really shouldn't end up together are gonna end up together because opposites attract, I guess, for them. So Reasonably, yeah, Garrett is the adrenaline junkie guy that is just kind of very much coming into this cast for the wrong reasons, ultimately wanting to justifiably be a Ghostbuster, but he doesn't have much of the technical side of really understanding much of the Ghostbuster Ash like stuff. But again, like he's just a guy that is like, yeah, I want to be a Ghostbuster, but I don't want to do any of the logic stuff of it. I just want to eventually just kind of beat my way through things and then just hope for the best. So here's where we get Roland. So Roland is kind of the guy that justifiably is the kind of high intelligence thinking character that I I think I like Roland probably like the most because ultimately I think when you get Roland, I think he is a character that kind of feels like very just he can be annoying at times and everyone could hate on him on certain episodes. But then again, there's also a lot of times where Roland is the guy that is coming up with the answers for a lot of the times. Where ultimately, he he is kind of the leader when Egon isn't. Like he is kind of basically like Ray, Winston, and Egon all kind of rolled into one reasonably if I think Kylie is kind of like the person that when you need to crack open a book, like she's there, but kind of Roland is kind of the person that could kind of like outsmart a lot of things. And so reasonably that's what I like about Roland is just he's the person that he is kind of this high end like intelligence and then reasonably when we have so many cracking whys he doesn't understand like he doesn't understand like what they're talking about and like I think there's some kind of funny moments of that where you have to where Roland is just kind of like yeah I guess I don't know like what the new age music is these days or like hey yeah I guess I'm not up on the slang of this year but so like I don't know, like kind of Roland is kind of like a give and take kind of character, but I think a lot of the times I see him as the leader of this group. Ultimately, a lot of people could fight me on that because ultimately they might see that Kylie could be the leader. I don't know. It kind of like to me overall, and or ultimately, a lot of people would say Egon is the leader. I don't think Egon is really like Egon is really not that really relevant for every episode. Yeah, there's sometimes where Egon actually does pop in and actually goes into some cases and actually does bust some ghosts, but reasonably Egon, like to me, is just the guy that is pointing to people, telling them where to go. He's basically a Janine Esch-like character. He's kind of relegated to be that. And then ultimately he's kind of there to bust people's chops. Ultimately knowing full well that they did a stupid move, and ultimately you would think that Egon is going to be busting people's chops and telling them like, God, like you need to learn, you need to learn better. And ultimately a lot of people like basically Egon is the equivalent of the principal in this show reasonably when it comes down to a show. Like he's kind of like the principal. Like he's there to bust chops, but reasonably he's just kind of the guy that is gonna keep on rolling with these people because ultimately like they are basically paying his bills. Because reasonably the Ghostbusters had to shut down because there wasn't any real calling for Ghostbusters to be out. So they just quit the business. And then all of a sudden they realized that eventually, oh, hey, yeah, I guess cases are starting to pop up again, so I guess we should look this up and see what's going on. So, yeah, that is the synopsis of the characters so far. Janine is just usual Janine, kind of really falling head over heels for Egon and again, and reasonably hoping that this time around, eventually, it'll really cement the relationship. And I think it quasi gets there at some point, but then again, they kind of play it aloof, so that way every episode, for the most part, feels bottled within itself. Even if it seems like they are going to finally cement these characters, they probably will never actually do that, just because it is what it is. So, Slimer. Slimer in this episode, if you guys remember the real Ghostbusters, it got to the point where it was like, Slimer, the show! And I was like, no. It was like, So, Slimer really is kind of the person that I think is kind of comic relief at some points, reasonably. I think it kind of gets to the point where Egon can really much more understand Slimer, and so reasonably, if Slimer doesn't know how to talk to people, he can talk to Egon, and then Egon can relay what Slimer is saying. You would think at some point Slimer would have been able to better talk to people, but even in this episode, he gets or in this series he gets much worse. You would think, I think Slimer in the real Ghostbusters, every once in a while you would get him to say some things that actually you could coherently understand, but in this one doesn't get there at all. He's kind of the Chewbacca of the team, where I guess eventually you have to speak Wookiee and eventually understand what he's saying. But anyways, Slimer is kind of a comedic act, so let's in fact get into this review of these 15 episodes, break down every one of these episodes, and kind of really gloss over them. So let's go into that double 5-time territory and break out into these reviews. Ultimately, like I said, we're going to kind of quickly go through these as much as possible. If anything, I liked how dark and gritty these episodes were. I like how they kind of felt like a ripoff from a lot of pop culture-ish movies. As if they watched a movie of some certain thing and then decided to do an entire episode about that ripping off thing. They ultimately even showcase in the episode where they took these episode ideas from, which I thought was interesting to really showcase, hey, yeah, there's a real legitimate thing that ripped off, and we're going to tell you where we got that from, which I thought that was funny. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time to get into these episodes. So the first 3 episodes are done within a story arc, having us transition to help us understand where everything is going. We have 3 episodes of a ghost named Akira, which ultimately is just a character that at some points is eventually spreading a virus and or disease, which again, kind of, if you watch this now, it kind of feels very current to this time, bizarrely enough, of it being 2020 and what's going on in the world today. But anyways, so we have it to where we have to kind of the big bulk of this stuff is trying to help you invest in every single one of these characters: Garrett, Roland, Eduardo, Kylie, even Egon if you haven't seen him in a while. So basically what ends up happening is, in the very first beginning of this episode, we have to where there's construction workers who are, of course, building much more to get an extension, I guess, of a subway tunnel, and one of the workers ends up kind of digging up some rocks that he wasn't supposed to. These rocks eventually unleash Akira, and this episode kind of starts out just like the real Ghostbusters episode, the Doomsday Door, where there's construction guys that are working, and then they find out that they've uncovered some door, and ultimately the Doomsday Door says, "This door will not be open until Doomsday," and ultimately they're like, what? It's like, no, we're gonna keep working. And so ultimately they're just like, yeah, let's keep working. Like I don't know what this door is saying about a doomsday. And ultimately they're trying to figure out when exactly was doomsday and this and that. So like they start stubbornly wanting to work on this door, and so the door opens, and then it ends up basically opening up some uh like ghosts all over the world, and like it basically like takes over a bunch of like trains and subway stations and stuff like that, and turns them all into big huge monsters, and has uh subways and trains that are all like filled with ghosts and skeletons and whatever. It's a really interesting episode, but anyways, so kind of opens up kind of like the doomsday door episode does for the real Ghostbusters. I don't know exactly what episode name that is, but probably go ahead and look it up. So it opens like that, and so reasonably we have it to where this big old esh like new age of monsters and ghosts and goblins and stuff all appear from out of this subway station, kind of showing us like, okay, there's a whole new batch of ghosts that are appearing. So showcasing reason why they have to do this whole entire series. It seems like in the opening part of this show, it seems like they had done a ton of opening sequence monsters that they never actually go into within this show. Like it's like they were planning on like, oh hey yeah, like how about we do a redesign of this character, or hey, how about we do a design of this character, but they never actually went and actually went through it. I think probably when going through this, I think what they were probably planning on doing was probably rehashing the real Ghostbusters episodes through here, and but then they realized, gee, you know what? Maybe that's not what this show will actually be. Maybe we'll just make our own beats or our own thing. And so, but they're like, but yeah, but we have this opening sequence kind of rehashing a lot of the real Ghostbusters cartoons into this opening scene. It's like, yeah, whatever. We'll just like Bashal that. Like it'll just be an interesting opening that doesn't exactly tie 100% to what's going on to these episodes, because that's what I felt like the opening was. It's like, okay, like they never have Sam Hain in this episode, which ultimately I know is a real Ghostbusters character, and a lot of the stuff I think in the opening doesn't exactly tie to the cartoon itself, I think, for a good portion of it, but I don't know. Anyways, so moot point. So we have it to where the Extreme Ghostbusters are all found out because ultimately uh, they all decide to be all college students that end up enrolling into Egon's class. And ultimately, there are all reasons why Egon is doing a college class, and there are all reasons why all these kids tended to go into this class. So Kylie, we find out the reason why this person really wants to be in Egon's class is because she believes in the paranormal. She has about 1 billion books about ghosts right next to her, like Ghosts Among Us, and even Egon's book. Ultimately, she read it cover to cover, and so ultimately, you have a real bookworm, book smart person that ultimately knows everything about paranormal. So ultimately, we have that kind of a way to where at any point in time we'll basically just have Kylie be the book person, and so ultimately that's the real reason why she came to this class, because she knows everything about ghosts, but ultimately she wants to know the most from Egon himself. We ultimately have Garrett, who comes into this class and ultimately just wanted to come to this class to just hear the really just every single story of Egon busting ghosts and how it was probably really fun and longevous for him to just keep busting ghosts all the time. Basically, Garrett doesn't care about the actual science behind busting ghosts. He just wants to hear uh, stories about them, uh, about all the stuff that they've experienced during his time of being a Ghostbuster. Like he basically wants to basically have it to where it's like a an interview over celebrity, like basically, or like a Comic-Con kind of panel, to where ultimately they would talk about their time on the show, and then ultimately you would have like a Q&A afterwards, or this and that. Like that's what he was kind of expecting. And so ultimately he was very much just kind of like once they actually get into the class, and it's very much like knowledge about the ghosts, and like Egon breaks it down into a very much scientific like pattern. We ultimately have it to where Eduardo comes into this class because he assumes that it's an easy A, and reasonably Eduardo is just like this character that ultimately, once going into the class, he eventually just falls asleep during the class. Because this guy, yeah, easy A, excuse me. But in a lot of ways, this character is just like, I don't think he's gonna really get anything out of this class, or even get an A out of this class, if anything close to it. So Roland comes in, and Garrett asks Roland if basically he he assumes that he's going to get an easy A out of this class, and basically Roland puts up some kind of joke. It's like, well, you know what, I'm not really popular with any of the real music that's coming down the pipeline, but like I don't know what easy A is, but I don't know. So Roland kind of goes into this class, and he is kind of fascinated that ultimately Egon is really breaking down all of this knowledge, and he's like, how is it that he actually has specs and schematics of a ghost, on how like basically he's like really cranking out the numbers, and like how is it that he has all this real knowledge of it, which doesn't quite make sense. So we have it to where ultimately Slimer is off at the firehouse getting all these different dials and pings on a PKE meter, telling him that there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. And so ultimately, Slimer goes into uh, letting Egon know that ultimately, hey, yeah, the PKE meters are going off the scale. Basically, through these episodes, you really get to start to see like a bigger PKE meter reading than you probably would through any other episodes. Several times when PKE meter readings would usually be sevens, and it usually wouldn't go any higher than that. Because ultimately, once you would get to seven, like basically sevens would usually be like god-ish like characters through a lot of the PKE readings in the show, or the movies or anything like that, through the real Ghostbusters. Now in Extreme Ghostbusters, we can have a blah, 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 a PKE reading of even like 13, or even much more bigger than that. So ultimately, we can have a much more grander scale of monsters and creatures to let you know it's like, oh no, this is even something so much worse of something that they faced before. So going into this, like, reasonably, we have it to where the Egon is like, you know what, hey, like, Slimer's coming in. He's found me in this class. He's ultimately telling me that the PKE meters seem to be out off the chart. So maybe I should go and check this out. Ultimately, he leaves his class to ultimately go and to investigate what is kind of going on. So they have it to where the Ghostbusters are all ending up going out. They're all in their street clothes, and basically they are all just throwing on proton packs and hoping for the best. Because recently, a lot of this equipment that they're wearing right now is just very much has not been used in a very long time. When ultimately Roland finally sees the Ecto 1, he's like, man, there's some lot of dust on this one. A lot of dust on this bad boy. But I need to get through a car wash. So ultimately you can really note that like Egon probably hasn't tested a lot of these things, and even when he goes solo and puts on his own proton pack, the equipment breaks down and this and that. So ultimately, we have it to where the kids go out first and try to uh, take down Akira, but reasonably, like they kind of do much more investigating, and then I think they quickly see Akira, and then like eventually she like quickly leaves because reasonably it's either that the the guys didn't really know how to use the equipment quite all that well, or recently it was just like the equipment is kind of faulty. And so recently we got a taste of that to ultimately see that like that there's some kind of troubleshooting going on to where it's not just so easy to master ghostbusting right away. So ultimately we have it to where a Kira has to look for a host. So ultimately, we have it to where Kylie is ultimately stealing a ghost beacon from Egon because ultimately he showcased that he has a ghost beacon, and so ultimately Kylie steals it, hoping to channel the spirit of her grandmother. So we have a very naive Kylie that is ultimately wanting to seemingly want to talk to her grandmother and instead ends up talking to Akira. Because at first Akira comes to her as her old grandmother and she ultimately hugs her and says, oh man, this is great. I get to talk to my grandmother who is dead. And then instead Akira takes Kylie and possesses her to spread her disease. Her disease that turns into these boils that ultimately is making a lot of people sick. It's kind of interesting to see her going through like an entire subway station and infecting people. Because that kind of reminds me of some like zombie movies like Rabid, where you would have like an entire subway that is just kind of eaten alive by zombies and everybody gets turned. Ultimately, at some point, like Kylie even turns a blind person sick. So, and eventually, also, when Egon decides to go solo and go on his own, he eventually ends up, like, is, of course, really out of shape. But on top of that, it's just, like, again, like, the equipment is not quite up to par. So by and large, like Egon is just like he's just kind of outclassed. He's just kind of out of shape, and just he gets taken down and then he gets diseased. So we ultimately have it to where the Ghostbusters have to take time and create new proton packs. We ultimately have to have them learn how to use said proton packs, and ultimately they have to recreate an entire ghost trap, because I don't even think they even used the original real Ghostbusters ghost trap through any portion of this. I don't think, like, I don't really even think that they really even used like the real Ghostbusters PKE meter. I think recently all you see is like the newer PKE meter within this. So I think there might have been like a kind of like pieces of a original one here and there, but I don't think they actually use the original real Ghostbusters PKE meter. I think there's kind of aftermath pieces of it somewhere. Again, anyways, moot point. So we have it to where eventually, like, we have this whole learning curve of them uh, trying to figure out how to use these proton packs, and them also having to rejigger the Ecto 1 to have a kind of a thing for Garrett to get out of the back of, and all this stuff going on there. So eventually we have it to where, of course, Akira is infecting all these people with seemingly boils, but then eventually these boils end up being like little things that eventually spore out of everyone's face, that seems to be these little like minion-esh like ghosts that ultimately will help Akira. So we have it to where that Kylie is gone, and ultimately all the other guys are just like, well, hey, like, it seemed like Kylie was, if anything, like the most interested about this whole Ghostbuster thing compared to anybody else. But like, where, like, nobody ever asked where like Kylie is. Everybody's just like, well, I guess she must have just uh like took her ball and went home. But anyways, so we have it to where while the Ghostbusters, the Extreme Ghostbusters, are all going out, eventually they bump into Kylie, and so Kylie, in possessed like form, is putting the moves on Eduardo, and then they eventually realize that she is possessed. Stupidly enough, Eduardo just blasts Kylie. He full on proton blasts Kylie, and I'm like, what the? I'm like, dude, like, she should probably just be dead right now. But I guess it is what it is. So we have it to where Akira pops out of Kylie because uh, Kylie got roasted, and so reasonably, funny enough, like Kylie is just like, you blasted me, and like basically like Eduardo's kind of chiming back is like, well, you were possessed, you were doing the Linda Blair thing. So basically Kylie is all ticked that like she was played by Akira, and now she wants to like uh figure out how to use their equipment. And I'm just like, well, yeah, it's like you gotta have a learning curve just like everyone else does. It is kind of bizarre that it seems like they really had to make Kylie like a unique Ash-like character. Like she has to have this like bizarrish Ash like outfit compared to everybody else. Then on top of that, her weaponry has to be different than anything else. Then she has to have like instead of a proton pack, she has to just throw the ghost trap on the back of her like shoulder pads, which kind of bothers me to this day. Why does she have shoulder pads on? Like, it looks cool, but then again, I'm like, I don't quite understand the character design of this character. Like, I guess it's trying as much as possible to look unique, but there's some stuff that I just don't quite get about it. So, anyways, we get to the point to where the little minions are coming out of everyone's faces, and so reasonably we get to the aspect of, okay, now like here's the big battle, and there isn't much to really have to outsmart this character. Reasonably, it's just like, okay, just get to a point of figuring out how to like perfectly blast this character and then trap her indefinitely. And there's not much of like trying to outwit this character, and like it's just a building of like getting to invest in these characters that you're going to see for the rest of this series, and then eventually getting to see this Akira character really kind of be this really powerful character, but then eventually just kind of gets snuffed out once they get the right equipment together and once they get all the characters together to then go after this person and basically just bust her and it's over. So, moving on, the very next episode is a Gollum Ash like episode, which ultimately I could have easily figured that at some point that this character is gonna like come up, just because it's kind of an easy thing to throw in here. And like during the time of this show, like golems don't show up that often. I think through a lot of other supernatural Ash like things, golem approaches much more. There's even movies, I think currently of movies about golems and stuff like that. So we have a Jewish rabbi Ash like church that ultimately seems to be consistently vandalized at night, or people break into their church to ultimately vandalize and otherwise just steal things. And so reasonably it ends up that seemingly a person in this church ultimately goes and gets a golem to ultimately protect his church at night. Because ultimately, we find out that the rabbi's son, the person who called upon this golem. This golem Ash-like character kind of turns out to be kind of like a Clayface Ash-like character. That ultimately, there's some characters that he beats down, and every single time that they go and have like a pipe or a wrench or something like that to beat down this golem, ultimately it just kind of like goes through the golem, or ultimately sticks into the golem, or ultimately like when the Ghostbusters blast the golem, like they just poke holes through the golem, but ultimately he just reforms, and like it kind of feels like okay, well that blast did nothing, it just slowed him down. So, and ultimately when the guy that is supposed to control the golem that completely fails, we kind of also have an entire episode building up to like Garrett's street smarts. So ultimately, we have him go off on this episode to kind of rekindle this relationship with some friend that ultimately leads into Garrett finding out that these guys were vandalizing this church, and so ultimately they're going to get their payback because there was some Gollum Ash-like character that attacked them once, so they're going to come back here to hope that they can beat this Gollum this time around, which they won't. So we have a lot of people in these episodes that are vandalizing the place that the Gollum is trying to protect, and consistently the Gollum kind of turns an entire body of a person into clay. Meaning, like, the golem basically clays a person's entire body to where they are kind of like the body is still there, and it seems like they're in some clay coma, But yeah, their body is entirely surrounded by clay, but bizarrely they're in some kind of like suspended clay animation. So recently in this episode, what ends up happening is they figure out how to eventually go, okay, this character has clay all around him. Like, we can only blast him so much to kind of slow this thing down, and eventually the golem can't really be controlled, but we ultimately know full well that this golem has some kind of paper inside of his mouth. So it gets to the point where the Ghostbusters figure out to try and harden this clay of this character to the point where the clay eventually breaks when the golem starts to move around more. And so after hardening this golem, eventually gets to the point where they break every single piece of this golem to where the only thing left is this golem's mouth. And so then eventually Kylie grabs the paper from out of this golem to where every single character that had made them a clay statue-esh like character has turned them back into normal. And so then everything eventually gets resolved into this episode. So yeah, this episode, it's an interesting episode to watch, but kind of looking at it is kind of like, to me, like, I could give or take this episode. Like, there's some stuff with kind of like Garrett that I really don't care for, or there's some stuff like a golem. Like, I don't really care for a golem that much. It's just meh. It is what it is. So the next episode after this is the Fear Itself episode, which I kind of really like more because recently you get to showcasing of what every single Ghostbuster is actually afraid of. So you get to get a little bit of backstory about some of these characters. I don't really know the actual ghost that actually puts fear into everybody in this episode, because I don't remember its actual name. So in this episode, you have us eventually having someone breaking down a wall and doing construction on some building. We end up finding out that this building ends up unlocking some ghosts that had been hidden away for a very long time through breaking down this wall. And so eventually this guy starts walking through this place where this ghost is at, but then eventually starts freaking out about heights, and basically eventually has to be pulled out via a gurney for losing his freaking mind. So eventually we have it to where it seems that people are kind of going in and kind of eventually realizing that, hey, yeah, like, we need to call the Ghostbusters for this one. So the Ghostbusters eventually go into this seemingly same place of which this guy had ventured into too, and we eventually find out every single one of everyone else's fears. So basically we find out that Kylie's greatest fear is that she hates maggots. And so basically she ends up pretty easily like having her first fear come up, but then no one else does. No one else's fear comes up right away. So like eventually it's one of those where they kind of hear Kylie screaming and they go to like find out what had happened to her, and she mentions that, oh my god, I was surrounded by maggots. Like, there's maggots all over me. It's like the only thing that I actually hate. And they're like, really? Like maggots? Like, why is it all of a sudden you bizarrely had maggots on you? And she's like, well, it's the only thing that I really am afraid of. Because really, it's kind of funny how through every single episode, like Kylie would say, it's like, oh, I'm not a screamer, or I'm not a squealer, or I'm not a I'm not a scaredy pants, or I'm not a this, or I'm not a that. And then ultimately she would eventually come to ultimately be saying, yeah, I do scream. Yeah, I do squeal. I do this. I do that. And this and that. So, anyways, we ultimately have it to where, like, they assume that this ghost is trying to open up every single one of their greatest fears, because ultimately the guy had a fear of heights. So ultimately, like, they're assessing that's okay, we're eventually going to see our greatest fear. And Garrett is saying how he's fearless, how he's like, yeah, I don't fear anything, woohoo. But at the very beginning of this episode, when Garrett is fighting a ghost, because ultimately he rushes in to ultimately fight some ghost into, I think, some bar. Ultimately, the ghost pushes him into some like closet-ish like space, and he starts freaking out because ultimately he doesn't like enclosed spaces, so he's claustrophobic. So, but ultimately, we in turn eventually see eventually to where the rest of the Ghostbusters end up rushing to Garrett's evade, because ultimately the Ecto 1 had broken down, and so ultimately they rush into the bar after Garrett to ultimately bust the ghost and then figure out where Garrett is. So we go into this, and so reasonably we eventually find out that Roland's only fear is for his equipment to malfunction. So basically, we have to Roland in this episode eventually has to throw off his proton pack for his proton pack to turn into a monster to try and kill him. And we ultimately find out that Eduardo's fear is death. That ultimately to see himself be a zombie or to be dead, I guess is his death, is his fear, his greatest fear. And it is kind of really funny that Eduardo as a zombie has to mention to normal Eduardo that he's dead. Like there's a scene where a zombie Eduardo goes to Eduardo and says, "I'm dead." And I'm like, why do you have to say that? Why do you have to say that? Ultimately, he knows that you're dead. What else would you be? So Eduardo is fighting zombie Eduardo, and then we ultimately find out that again that there is a coffin laying on the ground, and so Garrett realizes that the fear that is placed here, it wasn't placed for Eduardo, it was placed for Garrett, because ultimately Garrett fears enclosed spaces, so a coffin is pretty enclosed. So we get it to where ultimately one of these people have to face their fears to ultimately help others face their own as well. So we have to where Garrett eventually gets out of his coffin to eventually go to Kylie, who Kylie ultimately is faced with a gigantic maggot, and ultimately um he's coming to her trying to fight off this maggot, and ultimately it seems like this maggot isn't really doing anything vicious to him, and so ultimately like he's just not really understanding her fear. So eventually they all come together and they realize that it's like, well, hey, how should we try to beat these fears? And they otherwise realize, well, hey, how about we do this? How about we fight one another's fears? Because they aren't all together just going to easily just say, well, yeah, we're just going to face all our fears and win. No, everyone's going to fight their opposite, like fear. And so at the end of the day, everyone does that. So, and everyone beats it. And then once actually going into fighting the monster, or quasi trapping the monster that is giving them all this fear, recently they realize that this monster is just very afraid. And so he uses fear as a defense mechanism. Gives something that some monster or ghost or whatever is afraid of, so that way it won't attack it. So they realize how like defenseless this monster is, and how just overall they're just like, you know what, like we don't want to do anything to this ghost. We don't want to hurt him. We don't want to trap him. Like so they just end up, instead, after facing their fears, they end up just really very much just like putting that wall back together to ultimately just seal this monster into this place again. To where then I guess eventually, if anything were to happen to where this wall breaks down again, then ultimately they would just end up just having to eventually do something with this monster, but I guess it never comes up. So now we go into the Deadliners episode, the Craniac episode, the kind of Stephen King Hellraiser like ripoff of this episode, this next episode. So we have it to where this episode I think is really great. So we have it to where in this episode I think this one is kind of visually like very interesting. Like to me it kind of also kind of feels kind of clunky, because reasonably when looking at it, it feels like you've kind of seen this episode kind of done in a lot of other things, but it's kind of interesting. So because ultimately this has a real dark edge to it. So we have it to where seemingly that people are seemingly being taken by these characters that have like a very much like like a saw for a headpiece, and like some very drill for hands, and like a person with an eye in their hand. Very weird ash like looking characters. There's one character where his like mouth was like sewed in the middle, but then there was like mouth parts you could see like on the out on this part where you could kind of like see the person's teeth. Like really some interesting visuals here. So we have it to where there was a guy named Jimmy who ended up getting taken, I think, in this diner, and ultimately turned into a deadliner, a monster and or creep. And so recently the Ghostbusters end up getting called because Jimmy was taken. And it's starting to seem like there's a lot of people here and there that are starting to get taken. And so then eventually they are seemingly eventually getting to the point of like, okay, we're starting to realize that these characters are actually uh, tied to a book, because Eduardo um, had heard the description of these characters, and ultimately he's like, dude, this looks just like Craniac. And Craniac is supposedly a book from this thing called Deadliners, and supposedly it's a book for children. And ultimately, so Roland is like, dude, you read books, you read children's books. So we ultimately have it to where Garrett, bizarrely in this episode, is also trying to write a book as well. He's trying to write a book about his Ghostbuster-ish like experiences, but he's also doing a lot of this in fiction, because he's saying to the point to where eventually all the rest of the Ghostbusters all die for him to just go on alone and be his own true Ghostbuster. And that's what the story that he's writing is supposedly being about. And none of the other Ghostbusters really like it. if anything, when Eduardo does his review on the book, basically says it stinks. So we have it to where the Ghostbusters end up following and figuring out that reasonably, like, how about they go and talk to the author of these books, and because ultimately he's a local of this town. So ultimately we get to where the author of this town has a big ish-like home that is ultimately home to Craniac and his minions and folks and whatever. And so ultimately, like, Craniac and his people start really mass taking a lot of people, and so there's some points in time where some of the Ghostbusters are looking at, like, Jimmy as a new tortured soul of these people. And at first, like, they were just gonna blast him away, but Kylie's like, no, like, that's Jimmy. So ultimately we have it to where they figure out to ultimately go to the author's house to figure out, like, hey, like, what's going on, because the clue that ultimately is alluding to them needing to go to this writer is, uh, if it is not written, it can't be done. So if it is not written, it cannot be done. Ultimately, they're starting to realize that, okay, these characters are tied to a book, so let's go to the writer to ultimately see what he's writing, to ultimately see if he's the problem of all this. And so we have it to where we find out that the guys are going to this author's home, and basically this is the home of these characters. And we find out the author is basically tied to this chair, forcibly having to write this story, because ultimately this guy is realizing that these characters have made him so much money over the years that they themselves are now realizing, like, well, like, we want to get something out of this too, so we're going to come to the real world and you're going to write us a really good ending. And, like, that's the reason why the proton beams don't work on Craniac or his members, because the book won't allow it to be so. So we have it to where Garrett ends up writing some stuff into this story, eventually trying to slow down Craniac and his goons, telling them that they're getting beaten up by vicious monkeys with pipe irons, and then they end up getting, like, tossed to the side. Justifiably. We have to where ultimately Garrett eventually gets to the point to where he, like, gets to where he is writing the book, then he gets pushed away from the book, then he ends up trying to get back into the book to write the ending of the story, and then basically it ends up getting, like, sucked up to the point of them eventually getting, like, kind of getting to the point where they get, like, in this flame-ish, like, whirlpool where they all get sucked into this flame, and then eventually that's how everything just kind of gets resolved, kind of making an ending to this story that ultimately brings all the characters back to normal. And so then eventually, like, they ultimately say that Craniac has put out another book, but it ultimately isn't as probably as good as some of the other ones and this and that. And ultimately we find out Garrett had been pushing out these books to everybody and had been rejected. And so, yeah, that is just kind of what that episode is. It's kind of an interesting episode. I like the visuals of it. It's very dark. It's very interesting. But at the end of the day, let's move on. In this episode, we have a ruins episode where we have it to where like a ruins master or like a character that ultimately goes into this museum and steals a bunch of these little rock-esh like characters with these like kind of hieroglyphs on them. And so ultimately, while he steals this thing and steals these little rocks and tries to make money off of them, he ultimately realizes that every time he steals one of these little ruin-esh like rock things and tries to give it to somebody to usually pawn it off on, or ultimately to eventually have agenda, which he eventually finds after he tosses one of these rocks to somebody. Because there's a messenger that ultimately is to collect every single one of these people that ends up getting one of these rocks. So this messenger ends up coming for each one of these people to go into another realm where they are forcibly having to do labor for a character called Khalil or Khalil. Anyways, so or Khalil. Anyways, so we consistently have it uh to where this person is to have these seemingly ruins that are given to people and then they get sucked in this dimension and to where now since someone like figures out what is going on and figured out that it's this guy and ultimately had figured out kind of what had happened, basically it gets to the point to where ultimately once they kind of see some footage of this whole scenario going on, they're like, okay, hey, like we need to figure out who this guy is, and we need to track him down and ultimately find out where he lives, and break into his home, and like really try to track this guy down, because this guy ultimately kind of gives ruins to people that is like people that he wronged, to where he owes them money, so ultimately he throws them a ruin or a rock to ultimately get sucked into this other dimension by this messenger, and ultimately is just like, okay, well, I'm going to keep giving people that are in my way these ruins, so ultimately they can go into another dimension and I will never see them again. The messenger never gets sucked into this dimension, but ultimately, Eduardo eventually gets sucked into the dimension, and eventually he starts to have to translate all of these books or write all these books. So eventually, Kylie eventually finds out that there is some scripture to figure out how to reopen a portal in the dimension that Eduardo is in, but it only works that it has to work that they're actually in the dimension that Khalil and Eduardo is in. So it gets to the point to where they have to find this guy that has these ruins and get a rock and get one of the ruins from him, so that way they can go into this dimension to solve this whole case. And all while also getting these ruins, eventually the like Egon and Janine end up trapping the messenger in a ghost trap outside of uh the dimensional door, so that way the rest of the Ghostbusters can all go in and take their sweet time. So Khalil is eventually upset that Kylie and Roland had trapped his messenger, but then eventually once they head into this world they realize how really weak they are, and that realistically since this is Khalil's world, that it's Khalil's rules. So we get to the juncture of that Khalil is basically going to force people to do whatever he wants because this is his world, and so then eventually we have it to where Kylie has this scripture that she has memorized, because ultimately Kylie and Roland are going to be end up being Khalil's lunch if they don't actually say these lines. So Kylie says this whole line about uh, this rhyming thing about uh, scriptures being lifted and all of this, and she's like being stymied and can't figure out what all the words are. And Eduardo finishes the seance, says what finishes up the words that she's supposed to say, and that completely dissolves the Khalil character into just a thing of juice. And so then renders this kind of dimension moot, to ultimately the whole that was presented for them to go through ultimately is starting to shorten down. And so eventually they all mad scramble to eventually get through the hole, and then everything seems to be resolved. So Garrett asks eventually how Eduardo come up with that last part of that seance thing. And it's like, well, he was reading it from those books that Khalil was forcing him to rewrite. So that kind of resolves that thing. This episode is very clunky compared to a lot of other episodes. Like, it's interesting to kind of see like a common sense like episode where if somebody's desperate to get rid of people, like, hey, use this thing that is going to uh, collect people. So if you have any problems with anybody, just get it ruined and just figure that out. Kind of a clunky episode, but kind of take it or leave it. Kind of like it's probably a little bit better than the Golem episode, but at the end of the day, it's just another kind of middle of the road episode. So let's move on. Luco, Ghost in the Machine. Kind of like one of those, just kind of like you would kind of get usually one of these kinds of episodes all the time, to have like a ghost being fused into a machine. But supposedly this has like a very old entailed backstory of like some very old musician that ultimately was dreaming one night about the music of the spheres and all these bizarre like things. And so eventually this guy at some point had gotten a idea from a ghost to create this machine. So he does, and the ghost ends up taking this machine and wreaking havoc all over the world. And ultimately, I guess we would have to assume that this inventor had beaten this ghost before, but now, ultimately, since we have this machine on some display in some museum somewhere, and Roland had heard of the story of this inventor, ultimately he goes to the museum to ultimately see this this invention, and wouldn't you know it, this ghost decides to pop out and start fusing himself onto uh, certain uh, certain objects to transfer into a action figure, or a like a robot like action figure, that ultimately this ghost is called Luco. Like, I want to say Loco, but it sounds much more like Luco. So this ghost ends up in an action figure, and ultimately he is asking like what kind of body that he's in, and ultimately he's like demanding this this kid to ultimately give him information, which ultimately this kid won't give him anything. So eventually this kid tries to ultimately this action figure tries to attack this person, to the point to where eventually it's scaring this kid, to where eventually he has the Ghostbusters called. So the Ghostbusters end up trying to figure out what's going on with this action figure. The action figure ends up going into, or this Luco ends up going from an action figure to a lawnmower, and just bizarrely tries to attack the Ghostbusters with seemingly any certain kind of like at some point in this episode, like he attacks him with a crane at some point. So ultimately, they end up confettiing away this crane, and because they're at this construction site, and so they confetti away this crane by blasting the crap out of it, and we ultimately find out that their PKE meter is dead, and ultimately Eduardo is thinking it's like, well, we must neutralize the ghost somehow, but it ends up actually that the PKE meter has the ghost inside of it. So we eventually have Roland being very influenced by this ghost, ultimately having to forcibly take every little piece of the Ghostbusters equipment to make some machine for this new ghost. And of course, we have Roland, who is dreaming about music of the spheres and this and that, just like the previous inventor. And so Egon is forcibly having Eduardo telling him that he wants them to backpedal through every single thing to figure out where exactly the origin of this thing spurned out. And so ultimately we have it figured out that Egon figures that this thing came from this museum piece. So he figured out the museum piece, he figured out the backstory of this inventor, and so then ultimately he figured out that it's like, okay, we need to figure out how to like this ghost comes into machines and takes control of it and tries to do this and that. Because ultimately, like in the very beginning of this, like we find Roland inventing stuff. We find him like inventing a machine out of just random stuff that this home had, and eventually he makes a trash compactor, and ultimately he makes a rag that ultimately everybody's like, oh my god, this is a great piece of art. And he's like, dude, it's just a rag I wash my hands with. So eventually we get to the point to where ultimately Roland is grabbing every single thing from the Ghostbusters, even their TV set, to use in this machine. And ultimately, no one puts any red flags up with that. They're just like, well, hey, maybe he's just trying to uh, put together a better machine, and because ultimately we gave him crap about all his inventions prior, so give him a break. So ultimately, Roland creates this amazing machine, and then he ultimately turns it on, and the ghost goes right into the machine and tries to take over it. So now the Ghostbusters have to try to bust this ghost. The only problem is that they don't even have any equipment to be able to bust this ghost, because their proton packs have no energy in them, because of course Roland used everything, even the ghost traps. And so he realizes this, and so ultimately he decides to um like turn on one of the ghost traps to trap one of the ghosts, or to trap this ghost by using his own machine against him, because the machine has a ghost trap in it. So that's how this ghost ends up getting pretty easily beaten, just by really having Roland just kind of like already having a ghost trap kind of strapped to this machine, and then the ghost kind of just gets sucked in via that. Yeah, so that was that episode. Like it was kind of like an interesting thing, but I've kind of seen this kind of before. Like I even remember like the real Ghostbusters episode. I think it's called like Lost in Foundry, where you have a bunch of appliances that are all like seemingly walking around and eventually all turn into one big giant ghost at the end of this. Um, like like this episode kind of reminds me of that in a lot of ways, but it's kind of quasi different because it's a bunch of random uh, things that all come from one big soul ghost and all come combining together. Um, anyways, moot point. Let's move on. This next episode is kind of like it kind of feels very old fashioned ish. I think they kind of draw one character as like a very much like Vincent Price ish like character. This episode is an entirely thing about a haunted house, and this next episode, basically the monster in this episode is just the house. Like I think recently they called this thing like a French variation of the word the house. So we have to where in the very beginning of this episode we have two kids that are selling chocolate bars and are going to sell it to one house that seems like everybody's all going missing, and so they assume it's probably from this house. But these kids are stubborn and they just want to sell these chocolate bars, so they go to this house. They find out it's some old lady, and so they go into this house and they never come out. So parents end up coming to coming to the Ghostbusters, and because ultimately there is one house that seems to have it be a lot of people are missing in from having a lot of people missing from their neighborhood. They're all thinking it's from this house because ultimately it seems something ill explained. So ultimately the Ghostbusters check out this house. At first they're like, well, yeah, you know what? Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with this house. Like, it seemed like this old lady is nice, but then eventually Eduardo eventually looks around and finds a candy bar on in the house premises. So ultimately, he goes and has like a huddle with his team. Says, "Hey, I found this candy bar. Like, hey, there's something up with this house." The house realizes that, and so ultimately the old lady disappears, and the house starts to shift. So that's when we get this like Vincent Price Esh like character, um, who ultimately is like we start to see some characters that seem to be just kind of stuck within this house. Some of them some of them are dead. Some of them might be humans. Like the kids are still human. They're just kind of gooped into this house via some kind of like slime to ultimately they have to get kind of blasted free. So ultimately, we have it to where it seems that they are all trying to escape, and the house is talking about some feast. And so, realistically, I think it's just a fight for time. That reasonably, the house doesn't eat by midnight or past that time. I think that's what kind of really beats this house. So reasonably we have it to where the the people are just kind of like or the Ghostbusters really just kind of waiting for time to kill to ultimately just kind of get past midnight. And reasonably the maid is running around talking about the house needing to eat. And so yeah, they're eventually hoping that the maid is going to go with them to ultimately try to escape from all this, but the maid is already dead. So basically what ends up happening is that they kind of beat the midnight toll, and basically the house just kind of crumples in upon itself. And then ultimately Eduardo notices that the door knocker is off off the door or whatever, so he grabs the door knocker. He's like, hey, a souvenir. But then the door knocker ends up turning into a monster, and so they end up having to bust that. And like that's just how the show ends up just kind of wrapping up for this episode. I kind of quickly gone through this episode, but there's there's a lot of just kind of copy and paste from this from seemingly a lot of other things. This one I remember a real Ghostbusters episode like this one, where reasonably you have like two lions that are seemingly made completely out of like leaves or something like that. Like two two lions that seem to be in front of a house that were made out of like grass or something like that. In one episode of the Real Ghostbusters, where basically you have an entire house that is literally trying to eat the Real Ghostbusters, and it ultimately doesn't really pan out that way. But it was kind of a very intriguing episode. But yeah, this kind of feels like a copy and paste approach from going into yet another episode of the Real Ghostbusters and this and that. So yeah, it's just kind of like I I I probably really didn't care about this episode because it kind of felt very much like I've seen this episode plenty of times through any iterations of a lot of other things. It's not unique to just have some haunted house in the neighborhood. It's not really all that great. Moving on to Killjoys. So this episode is kind of the clown-ish like episode that I thought was really interesting, because knowing full well this is kind of like a quasi it kind of approach. This is kind of like a quasi it, or just legitimately like, hey, like let's actually make sense of an actual clown episode. And plus we have one of the characters that actually turned into a clown, that is one of the Extreme Ghostbusters, ends up turning into one of the clowns, and who do you think that is? So we ultimately have it to where in this episode the circus is in town, because we have one clown that ultimately goes and tries to attack seemingly one person who is laughing, and ultimately gobbles him up. So we have it to where Eduardo and Garrett are having a competition to see who is the best Ghostbuster. And so when they finally eventually get a call of a clown that seems to be attacking people, we have a to where Eduardo ends up having to quickly fast track this clown down, and so that eventually they end up trapping said clown. And and basically like Eduardo ends up doing it because him and Garrett are having competition, and he ends up kicking Garrett out of the way for Eduardo to bust this ghost. And then he has some bizarrish like song that he says like, Ecto Man, put the clown in the can. Ecto Man is the man, or something like that. It's freaking weird. So like he had some weird bizarre song, and like he's taking all the credit for this, but the problem with this is that there is more than just one clown-esh like character. We find out there's a whole circus in town, and so recently we have a bunch of clowns that are all going out, excuse me, and doing the same thing as the other clowns. So we ultimately find out that Eduardo comes home to seemingly find that he has a jack in the box. A jack in the box that ultimately, once opening it up, he notices that it is some clown head jack in the box that is going to bite him in the arm. So Eduardo is crazily running away from this Jack in the Box while the Ecto 1 is slowly but surely driving away. Eduardo is running to the Ecto 1. Roland realizes that Eduardo is behind him, and so he stops. Eduardo jumps in the driver's seat and tries to run over this Jack in the Box. And really we realized that this Jack in the Box was just to infect Eduardo to eventually turn him into a clown himself. Because ultimately, once they eventually start to try to find these clowns and try to bust them, ultimately Eduardo at some points lets them get away, or ultimately reasonably just starts laughing absurdly at nothing. And so eventually, slowly but surely, they start to realize that, especially once they find out, because Roland, bizarrely, in the beginning of this episode, has to laugh about something, about these silly jokes that don't make quite any sense to be really hilarious. So, in the very first ghost that Eduardo ends up taking down, we find out that every single time the Ghostbusters would hear somebody laugh, that ultimately they would be taken. And so, after Eduardo being the guy who ends up taking this clown down, they really start to realize that every time somebody actually laughs, that that is the thing that the clowns are gunning for, is they'll eventually take someone once they laugh. So ultimately, we have it to where Eduardo more and more is starting to slowly show some cases that eventually he's going to turn into a clown. So eventually he starts doing this juggling act. He starts flipping around, and so they're like, "Dude, there's something wrong with Eduardo." So ultimately, they try to contain him uh, into some like container for Eduardo to just kind of stay in this like little container. But ultimately, we easily have him open up this container because Slimer, of course, is offered a treat to be able to unlock him. So ultimately, we have it to where Eduardo seems to be turning into a clown and is eventually going to have to go up against the Extreme Ghostbusters, and as well as with the other clowns, to ultimately make Eduardo the new leader of all this. So we have it to where eventually we find out that these clowns are all transforming into these bizarrish, ugly looking, monsterish like creatures. And then eventually we find that there is one big key monsterish like character. So it gets to the point where it's just really Garrett and Kylie, because ultimately Eduardo ends up kind of sucking Roland into his hand. So we basically have Kylie and Garrett that is eventually going to bust said uh, said killjoyish like ghost, but also Egon is also on the case as well because he has Slimer using a fake joke, uh, a fake joke like thing to snare the ghost into thinking, oh hey yeah, this guy in this disguise is is laughing, and he's not really. He's just like a person that's a dummy to be a distraction. To where Egon eventually helps release Garrett and Kylie, so then eventually Garrett and Kylie can go and try to trap this ghost. They do, and of course everything goes back to normal. So, moving on to the next episode, Tenna Brog ultimately is a eye monster. Ultimately, it seems that this character is tied to some orb. Every time that it seems that somebody sees this orb, ultimately, this Tenebrock comes in and appears seemingly out of some other dimension and mentions that it's like, well, you you partaked in seeing this orb, so your sight I will take. Uh, not a very but he ultimately says this thing kind of repetitively throughout this episode. So we have Tenebrock, who is taking the eyes of people to making them blind for the rest of their lives. So we have it to where it seems that this museum is having it to where there's somebody that ends up opening to just check whatever this artifact is, and that's what their downfall. It gets people to eventually really cementingly use this orb for a real museum piece, and so it starts to be that people start to see this orb and start to go blind. So eventually they're going to put this orb on an exhibit to eventually have this monster eventually take everyone's eyes. So it ends up being that the museum owner is like, hey, yeah, there's something going wrong, like right around this certain orb, this certain exhibit. And so ultimately it gets to the point to where we have it to where the Ghostbusters are trying to realize that the owner of this museum had seen this orb, and so now they're trying to protect him. But then eventually, while Eduardo and Kylie are trying to fight this Tenebrog, we have it to where Eduardo bumps into the the orb and ends up seeing the orb, and then so eventually Tenebrog ends up trying to take his eyes as well. So it ends up Kylie ends up showing the orb to Tenebrog, and that's what ends up having Tenebrog end up uh, re-giving back everyone their eyesight, but then also end up taking all of his eyes as well and sucking him into this orb, and then they decide to break the orb quickly thereafter that, killing Tenebrog. So, like, I thought that this was a really fun episode. I thought it was pretty good to, like, it kind of felt random, but recently it was just kind of a fun episode. I really liked this one. Like, it didn't have to be one of those where it's like, oh, you have to bust the ghost now. You have to put him in a trap. It doesn't always have to be that way, and that's perfectly fine. So, let's ultimately move into the next episode that seems to be, I believe, very much a bug episode. Kohila is the character of this episode. So we have it to where there's two schmucks that ultimately try to decide to steal some diamond from this statue. They say that it's like a $10 million diamond. So they take this diamond from out of this statue, and I guess they awaken what is in this coffin etched like statue thing, and this thing is or was an actual bug monster. And so this bug monster loves all kinds of bugs and wants to see them thrive and otherwise be like his own personal hive. So anybody that this Kohila ends up getting involved with ends up putting bugs in people's bodies. And so eventually has them in a very alien-esque like way having these bugs coming out of people's mouths or just like kind of really pressing up against their skin, trying to pull out of this person's body. It looks very ugly and weird. Like a lot about this kind of reminds me about the Sigourney Weaver movie Alien, and it's really gross. Like this episode is really gross. And We ultimately have it to where Kohila is trying very much to find a mate. He's ultimately trying to figure out if there is some woman out there that won't want to kill any bugs. We're ultimately having Janine desperately wanting to go on a date with Egon. And so ultimately she's asking for him to go and like go to some fine dining ish like restaurant, and Egon's like, you know how much bacteria and how much uh like bug excrement or bug crap is at restaurants? She's like, oh, I guess you're right, whatever. So ultimately, we find out that Janine is the only person out of the whole entire Ghostbusters firehouse that doesn't want to kill a bug and just throws it into some kind of uh, paper or something and then just throws it outside of the house. So that's where Kohila is like, you know what? I think this Janine person is going to be my mate because ultimately she won't kill a bug. She won't even hurt a fly. So Kohila eventually asks Janine out, and so eventually Janine, of course, does. And so ultimately, the entire time this Gohila is talking about bugs and everything about him, because ultimately he talks to Egon before Janine goes on this date, and talks about the bug that the Ghostbusters had caught. Because ultimately, there had been one guy that had supposedly killed this bug, but then eventually they find out that the bug is still alive, and that ultimately it has some kind of like spray that it leases out. So they eventually find out that this little bug is really attracted to this guy that seemingly Janine is dating, and so ultimately, shortly thereafter, the bug vanishes. When after talking to this Kohila character, and so this and that. So we have it to where Janine goes on a date with this guy, and the entire time she's talking about Egon, and ultimately the entire time he's talking about bugs. So reasonably, we have it to where Janine is just using this guy to try to get back at Egon, hoping that Egon is going to get jealous, and Egon won't get that. So eventually, it just gets to the point where Kohila is just like, you know what, the real reason why I want you to be my queen, and ultimately he transforms from his Spanish-esque looking character to a bug character, and then forcibly has Janine uh, go into a cocoon to ultimately change into this kind of bug-esque like character. Ultimately, she's trying to transform into a different character altogether. So it seems that eventually the Ghostbusters are coming to the conclusion that this guy that Janine is dating is actually could possibly be this Kohila like character. So they end up finding out where this Kohila character lives, and they end up going there, and Egon goes as well because ultimately, like, he's there for like to protect Janine because ultimately, like, this is personal. So funny enough, we have Egon and everybody going to Kohila, and they're ultimately presented that Janine is a different person now, and ultimately she'll do whatever Kohila says. So Kylie has to forcibly tell Egon to tell Janine that he's like, well, hey, like why are you going with him? Because I love you. And so Egon is like, oh, I have to tell her that I love her. And Kylie's like, well, yeah. And so Egon saying it's like, well, I love you. Like, and then Kylie's like, yeah, you should kiss her. And so Egon's like, kiss her? Like, do you think that's really appropriate? And Kylie's like, come on. And so he's like, Janine, I must kiss you. It's like, plant some sugar on me, baby. And this and that. And so Janine ends up kissing Egon, and then Kohila tells her, it's like, well, hey, like, she's mine now. Like, she'll only listen to me. And like Janine's like, yes, I will only listen to him. But there's a whole trick going on behind all this. And Kohila is very much trying to kill uh, Egon, so he ends up trying to put all these bugs all over Egon's body to just get smothered and get killed. But we eventually find out that we have an old switcheroo going on, to where Janine ultimately has the ghost trap that is going to suck Kohila in and ultimately take him down. So that is eventually how all this eventually gets resolved, and surefire enough, we have it to where Egon and Janine kiss yet again, um, because ultimately really cementing that these characters should have been a couple all along and never really quite really were. And ultimately Janine was just trying to make Egon jealous with this whole dating thing, but didn't really quite work out because Egon is who he is. So ultimately, whenever Janine kisses Egon again, because ultimately she wants to remind him that every single time that Janine wants to go on a date with him, to remember that kiss. So that's kind of how the episode kind of resolves. I really like this episode, just because it finally cements that Egon and Janine were supposed to be a thing, but it just bizarrely never happened that way, because why would there truly, really, legitimately be that? So, moving on to the episode that I'll call Piper. So we have this ghost that, of course, uses, like we've seen in some episodes before, that there is music to snare people. We've seen the Ragtime Blues episode, where ultimately there is a battle between this seemingly jazz band playing this one music to control people of this town, and the Ghostbusters end up trying to counteract this music with much more current music that keeps them in a certain time period that is much more current, where the Ragtime Blues Band is trying to teleport them to a certain time period, this and that. It's back and forth battle, fairly interesting, like that episode. I think in this Piper episode, we've kind of seen this before, where we've had like a Pied Piper like character that is using his fiddle or his flute or whatever, have ghosts go to town, and then ultimately he forces the town to, hey, these ghosts are coming out of the woodwork. Hey, like, I'm the only one that can take them down. Because the Ghostbusters can't use their proton packs against these little small ghosts, because ultimately these ghosts are kind of like counterparts of a bigger whole. So they need to figure out what the bigger ghost is, and it ends up actually being Pied Piper himself. So recently this Piper character ends up showcasing that he is the big villain, the big bad of all this, and so that we have it to where the proton packs don't work against these little small ghosts, but ultimately they realize that when all the small ghosts come out of the Piper, that weakens Piper, and that ultimately they can figure out how to use their proton packs on him and trap him. Because recently a lot of this kind of comes down to the ghosts end up wreaking havoc all over everywhere, to where the government ends up having to fund Piper because it seems like he can get rid of the ghosts, but then eventually Piper, once he supposedly gets rid of the ghosts, he's like, well, you know what? Like, I'm gonna renegotiate now because I don't think my fee is good enough. I think you need to build a statue of me and this and that, and the government official isn't having it. So basically, he just frustratingly just goes like, no, I'm not gonna give in to you. So it ends up that the Ghostbusters at the end of all this end up busting said Piper and eventually taking him out. So that's kind of what that episode really just alludes to. Um, I feel like I've kind of seen this episode a lot through a lot of things, so this one wasn't like really all that great to me, but it was kind of a fun episode to see that ultimately like the Ghostbusters were even thinking at some point that they're like that ghosts are starting to like not quite connect to the proton packs anymore, like their powers are useless, and like they're almost gonna like have to give up being Ghostbusters because the ghosts are no longer seeing the power of the proton packs to fall prey to it anymore. So that was kind of an interesting dynamic to kind of scare people on. So I, excuse me for those yawns. I apologize. Getting to the point of getting to a very long-winded review. But anyways, let's move on. So within this next episode, we have like a careful what you wish for kind of episode. We have a monster in this episode called Do Wafflemies. Dewolfamies. I'm probably saying that wrong. Dewolfamies. Something along those lines. So we have a salesman that is going through and granting people's wishes, but the only problem is he is twisting them. He's twisting their words around. Ultimately, the salesman goes around, and ultimately, at first, he ultimately has a saying of no payment do I need, satisfaction guaranteed, and this and that, and and so ultimately he's going from people to people and asking them like if there's any random thing that they could have ever wanted. So the person that is working at this subway is mentioning that he would like some peace and quiet. If anything, he's kind of tired of even hearing the sound of his own voice, so he loses his mouth. So we eventually get to where the Ghostbusters end up wanting to talk to this guy that worked at this subway station, and ultimately they can't talk to him, but they forcibly have him write things down, ultimately telling that a salesman had done this to him, and so ultimately they try to figure this out. So more and more wishes start to come up. Eventually somebody asks about wanting to get back with his parents, ultimately going back to his old roots. So he eventually just changes and morphs into becoming a tree. Ultimately, someone wishes that they were made of money, and they end up becoming completely made out of money, and were confettingly people just are crazily grabbing this money, and yeah. So there is one woman that basically simply asks to look a bit younger, and she basically looks like a baby, and so on and so forth. So eventually they get to the point of we have Eduardo, who is who is sitting down, and the salesman ends up sitting next to him, ultimately asking, "Hey, where do I go to ultimately get a lot of people, like a busy place of here?" And ultimately, he goes to a flea market. So the salesman kind of asks if there's anything that he can do for Eduardo, and Eduardo says, "Well, like, hey, like, yeah, if you could make it so my friend Kylie like treats me as well as as she does her cat." And so ultimately, the salesman takes that wish, and basically Eduardo becomes Kylie's cat. So consistently, like, Eduardo is trying to spell out to the Ghostbusters that he is who he is. This cat named Pagan is trying to tell, like, hey, I'm Eduardo. Just letting you know, I'm Eduardo. So reasonably, we get it to where this cat is just tying himself onto the case, but a lot of times they're treating him like a cat, not Edward. So, or Eduardo. So Eduardo eventually comes on with them to the case, and eventually they're trying to figure out what wish can undo all this, because one other person's wish is that uh, he wished things were like the old days, and eventually uh, a a lizard ends up turning into a dinosaur. So, anyways, we get to the point to where eventually, like, they are trying desperately as much as possible to get this guy to stop making wishes. So every single one of the Ghostbusters, with the exclusion of Eduardo, because he's already made his wish, eventually they are trying to, like, not wish anything. The salesman is opening up some like visual aid for them to want to wish, but ultimately they decide not to. So they try to figure out what would be the one wish to undo everything, and so Eduardo eventually types on some mechanical thing somewhere that he mentions, like, "I wish that you will not grant me this wish." So it's a kind of oxymoron-ish, like, wish that ultimately kind of confuses some of the other guys, because they're trying to figure out what a wish would be to ultimately really tick this monster off. So we have it to where this wish kind of undoes every other wish, and then this monster ends up kind of fusing between the salesman and this actual monster, because it's two ghosts in one. So eventually they end up blasting and busting this ghost and end up taking him down as per usual. And then they're all surprised that Eduardo had come up and figured out how to beat this ghost. And then they also asked him, it's like, well, hey, have you learned anything while being uh, Kylie's cat? And ultimately, Eduardo says, "Oh yeah, Pagan told me a bunch of stuff. It's a real eye-opening experience." And so Kylie's like, "Well, what are you talking about?" And Eduardo says, "It's like, well, hey, like you gotta ask Pagan, and he'll tell you." So reasonably, that's that episode. Uh, I really liked this episode because I liked the whole, like, I love, like, a episode that is upon wishes, and especially with ones that usually go haywire. I think probably this one is probably my favorite one. I think the main reason why I did 15 episodes out of this is because ultimately that was the reason to ultimately get to this episode, because I wanted to talk about it because I enjoyed this one the most. Um, this one is probably by and large this one, and maybe there's some couple episodes here and there that are kind of good, but, like, I like this one probably the most because I like the whole wish dynamic, and to figure out how to kind of break this whole salesman thing. Like, yeah, that's kind of what I liked. So moving on to the next episode, which kind of mm, mm. So this next episode is about a gremlin. So they kind of ripped this off of the Twilight episode, and so reasonably we have it to where a gremlin is very much going through and like taking down certain like computer companies, taking down certain phone companies, and this and that. And so ultimately, we find out that there is a gremlin on the loose in one of these companies, and so eventually, the gremlin ends up taking down a train station or a subway station, and that's what gets the FBI involved. So the FBI is thinking that it's bizarrely some hooligan that is kind of dismantling this. They don't think it's a ghost. But then eventually assume that it's the Ghostbusters that are doing all this, that bizarrely they all have grudges because of the lives that they've all led, which isn't true. So the FBI eventually is thinking that it's the Ghostbusters because eventually it seems like they're the only people that are around where these cases are at. So we eventually have it to where the FBI is assuming that these Ghostbusters are all going to be the people that are gonna be the people that are destroying all things and this and that. So it ends up being that the Ghostbusters end up trapping said gremlin, and ultimately we have like a huzzah like moment, and all the while the FBI is kind of following the Ghostbusters to try to catch them in the act and then cuff them. Ultimately, the Garrett and Eduardo end up blasting what they think is a gremlin because they don't know that Roland and Kylie had trapped the gremlin. So the FBI ends up arresting all the Ghostbusters because they think that they're doing all this stuff, but in all actuality it was a gremlin, and they're desperately telling the FBI guys to basically open up the trap to see this gremlin. But then, like, that's a stupid thing. They want them to open the trap up to see that it's a gremlin, but then they also don't want the gremlin to come out of the trap because ultimately then. Because what happens is, bizarrely, the FBI is on this plane with the Ghostbusters, and eventually they open this trap up to try to be convinced that, yeah, it is a gremlin that is in this trap. So eventually we get it to where ultimately Garrett is cuffed, but he ultimately mentions, like, hey, like, how about you guys don't cuff me? Because I'm looking at it, it's like, what am I gonna do? Run away from all this? Because ultimately I can't, because I'm in a wheelchair. So they take his handcuffs off, and eventually he throws the FBI agents into one another, and then runs off to try to beat this gremlin ghost. So eventually they get the proton packs, and then eventually they decide to fight off this gremlin because the FBI believe that they're telling the truth because eventually they see Slimer on this plane, and so ultimately they decide, well, what the heck, we're going to believe these characters. So they ultimately see the FBI sees Slimer and think it's Gremlin. No, it's not the Gremlin. And so ultimately they convince him, but yeah, but the Gremlin's still in here. So eventually we have it to where Garrett is fighting off this Gremlin, really wrestling with it. But then eventually they have to open up the door of the plane to depressurize the plane, so that way Eduardo can pop a shot off to take this ghost and blast it and then trap it. And so the FBI is fully believing that these people did this, but they can't really tell anybody. Because ultimately, the news report that ultimately they were fed was that the reason why this plane was damaged was from satellites, and it makes no sense. But ultimately, the FBI puts this case under top classified and this and that. So that's what happens to that episode. So in the very last episode, this is kind of the episode that I've probably grown about the most because I don't really care for this episode. It's it's Ghostbusters going on a vacation and it ends up turning into a case. I don't like these kind of episodes. Plus, I don't like I just don't really care for this entire episode where you have it to where like the Ghostbusters are Ghostbusters because they have to kind of eventually get to their proton packs eventually sometime at the end of this episode. So they figure out how to beat this. They figure out how to beat this ghost without using 1 ounce of their equipment. So they end up all coming to try to figure out how much a sword is worth. They all come to this town. They ultimately were thinking about all going on separate vacations, but instead they all decided to go into this one place to ultimately, because Roland has to get a price put together for this sword that has some historical value. So we find out that this Jersey Devil ultimately is a character that seems to be trying as much as possible to destroy metal, to where every time somebody has a metal object, he confettis it away. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that there is an iron process that seems that we find out that uh, this kind of person who knows knowledge about the history of this town ultimately has a bunch of iron that he can ultimately go and attack this Jersey Devil. So ultimately, we have it to where we find out that the blade that ultimately Roland has is a piece from the Jersey Devil made from some cannon to be some sword and this and that. Anyways, so reasonably it gets to the point where they eventually keep uh, trying very much to attack this Jersey Devil with any number of kind of uh, random-ish things to take this thing down. Bunch of iron, bunch of this, bunch of that. So eventually it gets to the point where they just shove this monster into this big furnace, and that's what eventually takes this thing down. Which ultimately they didn't need to get their Ghostbusters equipment because it comes down there too late. So reasonably, like this last episode of the Jersey Devil, I could care less about it because I didn't really care about this episode. I really honestly hated this episode, but kind of had to get through it anyways. So I'm gonna go out of here, say that is all for this review. It was a very long-winded thing. I apologize for yawning at any points. Like it's starting to get to that stretch of time. Just go okay, yeah, it's probably time to just call it a day. So anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.